Rob, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
So we're going to talk about the book that you co-authored, came out in 2020. It's called Lessons from the Titans. Would love to hear a little bit about your background and why you and your co-authors decided to write this book.
Sure. The book is, we have extraordinary access. We get the chance to travel the world, see factories everywhere, talk to both, CEOs, CFOs, and also line managers, at factories, people doing marketing, all sorts of stuff. So the career is a really fun one. The access that we get is amazing. And then you just sit and think, what can I do to share? Scott Davis and I were at Morgan Stanley, now getting on to be a little while ago, and at Barclays together. And one of the reasons we found Emilius and wrote the book, to be fair, is that you have a little bit more freedom, a little bit more chance to expand, spread your wings a bit, and explore ideas in a different, deeper way. So that's the genesis of it.
Awesome. Emilius is the market research firm that you co-founded with Scott, and you guys also wrote this book around the same time that you founded the firm.
It was a busy couple of years, yeah. So we are a research boutique, so basically stock analysts, as we've done for a couple, 3 decades now. And yeah, it was a lot to get the firm off the ground and do it, but it was a labor of love, let's say.
I'm sure. What are some of the job responsibilities of a sort of seasoned stock analyst? Like I didn't realize until I read the book that you all are meeting one-on-one with CEOs and CFOs, and I'm sure they're trying to win you over however they can.
It's interesting. To be fair, I think the job of corporate IR functions, maybe the job of senior leaderships and so forth, and in some ways our job is to get as close to possible to the truth as you can, to reduce uncertainty. So obviously, valuation is affected by a lot of things, future growth, but also the certainty around that growth. And so clear communications, clear understanding can reduce uncertainty and therefore enhance value in some ways. You can do the job of a stock analyst in a lot of different ways. You can be on the road seeing every facility. You can sit there and think about strategy, maybe not the most productive way. You can do lots of different things as long as you're trying to add value to investors and ultimately people whose retirement savings are invested in the market. Again, one of the things we tried to do here at Emilius is step away from the quarterly focus, which many are good at. It's a very competitive thing, and try to think about really long-term drivers of outperformance, of alpha creation, and kind of the lingo of the industry. And so that's what we've done.
Awesome. So the book covers a number of different case studies, essentially focused on one company per chapter that you all focus on in your careers and companies that you all at least individually are experts on. You wrote about 3 different companies, Caterpillar, Stanley Black Decker, and then United Rentals, and we will dive into all those. Let's start with Cat. So at a high level, what does Caterpillar do? And what created some of the issues that they were having when you wrote the section in 2019?
No, for sure. So Caterpillar is actually a fairly diverse company, and they are critical kind of to the infrastructure of the world. And so people probably picture a Cat bulldozer or a Cat excavator doing construction, big yellow machines. And little known fact, almost all construction equipment is yellow because that's the color Cat picked. And they were just such the dominant force that people are like, well, we can't sell it if it's green, so let's go ahead and make it yellow. And so that's what they do. But they also have other businesses. So they make gas turbines that sort of power the gas pipelines around the US and around the world. They make backup engines, diesel engines. Data centers is a huge thing now, and they make giant diesel engines to back up dozens or hundreds of megawatts in that way. They make mining trucks and increasingly high technology mining trucks. So they do autonomous mining trucks. And at one point, and it may still be true, I don't know, they had run more autonomous miles than anybody in the world, probably have run more productive autonomous miles than anybody in the world because they're circling hundreds of tons of ore autonomously and safely. It's a big and broad reaching company affecting the infrastructure of the world, I would say.
How does forecasting factor into their business?
So yeah, you'd asked what caused the problems that led to the chapter in the book. And I don't want to minimize them. From the outside, sometimes you see problems, but you don't have to make the decisions that actually affect things. So what had happened, and it's in some ways repeated itself in the world, is we had a long period of anemic growth in the US. When you're running a company like Caterpillar, you have to make decisions, on a decade-long basis on how much capacity do we have? How big is our plant? How many units can we put out? Just classical manufacturing things. And I think the company had largely underinvested. The other problem, and it's really just fascinating, I grew up, in the 1980s, you would see sort of the Japanese invasion, the culture of lean at Toyota and the continuous improvement. These things were really sweeping the popular culture in some ways and causing fear. But really, it was just an absolutely transformational way of operating a business that people had pioneered and Toyota had been a big part of. CAT had not adopted that. And so they walked into the 2000s with demand all of a sudden surging on the housing bubble, on mining, on China's rise, which is kind of unpredicted before that. And so you had these huge demand increases, and you had a company that was not quite capacitized to do a huge amount of volume, but also maybe didn't have the production systems in to manage volatility well. And so it was, in some ways, kind of a sleepy manufacturer, I guess, if you wanted to simplify it down.
You talk about how you visit a factory and you could see that their first pass rate was not high enough, which means that when demand spikes, they're not able to tap into all that demand because there's sort of too much waste on the line. Can you talk about that visit and sort of when that moment happened and what that means for their business?
Sure. There's a lot to it, but effectively, again, the demand had surged and they weren't quite there. And so they were trying. I mean, above all, I think CAT wants to serve its customers. Its customers are calling for mining trucks because they desperately wanted to sort of serve China's demand. And they're trying to do it. And they're trying to push more volume down through a factory than you should. One of the transformational things in lean manufacturing toward production is any factory worker, and this is a true thing. It seems crazy, but any factory worker can pull on the cord and stop the whole production line. And there's a real reason for that. So if you're building lots and lots of cars, just running them through, and there's a quality issue, there's an error, you can stop it and fix it. You call an engineering talent. If you swarm it right then and there, you fix it, and then you don't have defects, you don't have safety issues, God forbid, or other things down the road. And so the power that you put in the hands of the people on the production line is massive. And I don't think that was a thing people really thought about in the 50s or 60s or 70s. So what CAT was trying to do was to put stuff through, and they're having quality errors. And so they would never ship something that wasn't good. So they pulled off the line, put it to the side, and let it be fixed later. And maybe didn't have the full lean expertise or the culture or whatever to say, let's just shut this thing down. Let's not worry about our delivery schedule, not worry about our profits for now. Let's fix this issue before it goes on again. And maybe that's oversimplifying a bunch because you have a very complex supply chain. If you're missing a single hydraulic hose for a bulldozer, you can't finish it. So what do you do? There's lots of difficult questions. But history has taught us the right thing to do is to stop, get it all fixed, get everything flowing, and move on again. And they didn't do that. And so you go to a lot of factories, and I've talked to a lot of execs as, what do you look for when you go to a factory visit? And the answers are actually surprisingly similar. They're clean sight lines. I want to see that you can look down and see where the flow is going, what's happening. I want to see that there's not a lot of inventory around. It sounds overly simple, but if you have that, that means you have the inventory coming in at the right time, getting put on the right thing at the right place and moving on. And so you don't have these pileups where something's gone wrong. At that factory visit, I wasn't a very seasoned analyst at that point, but I could look at the first aid booth and see that it was covered in buckets or bins labeled rework and know that something wasn't there. And again, I think CAT's heart in some ways was in the right place. They were trying to get product out. They were never going to ship a product that was not quality. And so it devolved into chaos.
Yeah, so I think you talked about how an ideal sort of first pass rate is around sort of in the mid 90s, and theirs was maybe in the low 80s or something like that. So when demand spiked, they couldn't meet that all demand as quickly as they should have.
Exactly. What you're referring to is it was a thing called first pass quality. It's a metric in factories, and it will vary industry to industry. But obviously, you're hoping that everything comes down the line right. And maybe that's not possible in every situation, but it was too low. And again, I was not the most seasoned of analysts at that point. I hadn't seen hundreds of factories, and you go to factories and they show you what you show and you think about it. But some of these things just jumped out at me. I was like, oh gosh, that seems low. Is it low? Yes, it's lower than we'd like for this. Yes, this is stuff that's rework. And so aside from the fact that it meant you couldn't quite get enough out, it also meant that the whole system just wasn't humming right. And one of the great lessons of manufacturing is you need to make a very complex system all come together at the right spot in the line to make it work. And they didn't have that happening.
In 2019, when you wrote this section, they had misforecasted a little bit over the previous decades. But since you wrote the chapter, the stock has more than doubled. So what has gone right since the time you wrote this?
Yeah, exactly. And a lot has gone right. So if we think about that factory visit I did, that was under a prior CEO, Jim Owens. His successor came in right in the middle of the financial crisis and a lot had gone on, but he had watched the factories running like this. He'd been running a different division that was actually humming, to be fair, and was incensed, partly because they were losing market share because they couldn't get product out and so on. And so his solution was, let's run at 100 miles an hour. I know the demand's going to be there. Let's add capacity. Let's build more machines. Let's add inventory just in case somebody wants it so we can fulfill our customers' demand and so forth. And again, those were bold and risky decisions that kind of flew in the face of the Toyota production system and the lean manufacturing and different things. that manufacturers have learned over the decades. And it didn't work. So demand happened to collapse. It turned out that the Chinese demand is real, but as is 100% typical in manufacturing, their customers would double order and triple order, just have extras because it was boom times, and it all fell apart. And so you ask what happened subsequent to that, and CAT is doing exceptionally well now. So the current CEO, Jim Umpleby, had a different philosophy, and it's kind of like what we read about in the book. It certainly was lean management focused, and that sort of thing can take years to bring on and to cultivate, but CAT's worked on it for a long time. And very data driven and very much around let's make all decisions based on customers, safety probably first, customers, but also on the right ROIC, and let's not make heroic bets. Let's just try to do the slow and steady and hard work of producing to demand and not outguessing too much. So anyway, margins have come up dramatically. Safety has improved dramatically. One thing I will say, in the midst of all that chaos, when Doug Oberhelman, who we talk about in the book, stepped in and made these big bets that didn't work out, the very first meeting I saw him in, the very first chart he put up was safety. He's like, our safety record is not good enough, and that's unacceptable. Safety often correlates with good production. So that was another sign that things were out of optimal control. But he came in and he focused hard on safety as well as everything else. Under the current CEO, Jim Umpleby, that record has gotten much, much better. And so CAT shows the signs of being a quality manufacturer with reduced volatility and more disciplined focus.
Is it fair to say that part of the success they've had over the last 5 years is due to the foundation laid by the two previous CEOs?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's fairness to that, because Jim Owens had started lean. Doug Oberhelman had focused on some of these things as well, and Jim Umpleby brought a lot of discipline to it. I think any of them would say that CAT is a large organization that relies on its employees, its dealers, and so it's obviously very much a team effort. And one of the key things that we talk about in the book is that making something work in industrials is culture. And we didn't want to write a book again about business systems, but culture is what happens when you know what you're doing every day. You know what you're supposed to do. You know you're allowed to pull the cord and stop the entire production line, because that's what you do when you see a quality problem. You don't hope that it goes away 10 units later, if you see what I mean. And so all of these things are a leadership challenge, but also a matter of getting an organization of 100,000 people all kind of working in the same direction. We've seen that lean transitions take time. You can't do this in a year. You can't do it in 3 years. You probably can't do it in 5. And so there's a lot of groundwork. But certainly Jim Umpleby has put a lot of discipline and a lot of sustained focus on making these things work, and it's paid off for CAT.
Seems like it. I've heard culture described as the decisions that employees make when they answer their own questions. And yeah.
Not a bad one.
So Stanley Black Decker, at a high level, what do they do?
So Stanley Black Decker is a tools manufacturer. So if you've had a Black Decker, obviously that's kind of the consumer-facing brand, but DeWalt, drills and angle grinders and any number of storage solutions, et cetera. They also own the Craftsman brand, which is an iconic kind of brand out of Sears back when I was a kid. Back when my grandparents were kids, you could buy a house from Sears, and it'd ship on the railway and it'd come out. I've been in a few of those. Anyway, the Craftsman brand was the tool brand of Sears, and they own that and manage and manufacture tools, let's say.
Got it. In the late 90s, the company was starting to struggle as a lot of the U.S. was offshoring a lot of the manufacturing. So SB decided to do the same. And this was good for their financials, but it created issues within their culture. Can you talk a little bit about that trade-off they made?
Yeah, so there's a couple of really big themes here. One is, if you're making a wrench and it's not that differentiated a wrench, how can you make it in a high-cost labor country? And that's sort of the story in many ways of American manufacturing. And it's a hard story for a lot of small towns in America. And so overseeing becomes a necessity. You don't necessarily choose to do it. You sometimes have to. Otherwise, you're faded out and somebody else is making the wrench overseas. It comes with problems that I think the entire country is facing and responding to right now, in that, for one, supply chains get long, so things can get really haywire. So in an ideal world, you get an order, you make it that day, and you ship it out. Now, if you're dealing with a supply chain that's 3 months long in 27 different countries, you can't do that. So there's a lot of planning and balancing and trying to reduce. Going overseas amplifies that. One of the issues Stanley had in the late 90s that unfortunately recurred during COVID was that they would innovate. They would have a new iteration of a tape measure, of a drill, or of whatever. And often the innovations were interesting and people liked to buy them, and they wouldn't retire the older one. So now all of a sudden you're trying to manage a longer supply chain with 50 things you're making instead of 20. And the potential for variability and loss among all those steps gets to be pretty profound. And so that's a key issue that Stanley ran into back then and unfortunately today.
So you mentioned this, that there's this notion of sort of being customer obsessed. And I work in early stage tech investing, particularly in the tech industry. Being customer obsessed is the sort of like first principle that a lot of companies try to adhere to. Stanley Black Decker did that. But as you're saying, it got them into some trouble, right?
Yeah, so depending on how far forward you go, but let's spool forward in time a little ways to when we wrote the chapter and then what happened after. We wrote the chapter because we saw and this is absolutely the case, and I mentioned earlier with Caterpillar and autonomous mining trucks, there's a lot of technology that's weaving its way into industrials and adding a lot of value to customers. In the consumer tool world, I mean, you can picture, and they exist now, they didn't back then, autonomous lawnmowers where it's electric, it's not polluting, it's not two strokes spewing out dirty fuel, it's just electric zipping around your yard and mowing the lawn for you. And so we wrote the chapter about kind of embracing that innovation, about looking at what customers are looking for and managing that whole process. And a few different things went wrong. So one is COVID happened. And again, you have these very long supply chains where people are desperate. Everybody's home all of a sudden. The whole world changed and everybody wants outdoor tools and you didn't plan to make that many. And so you have to work on that. And that was inevitably going to cause some problems. But two, what happened is they kind of did the same thing that Cat did. They abandoned lean in the midst of all this. They said, all right, let's just try to serve the customer. Let's give them whatever they want. Let's build everything we can. And then neglected the basics of the business, which included, hey, we just launched 5 new iterations of this drill. Let's cancel the old 5 so we don't have double the parts and double the complexity to manage. So that was one of the issues, that this long supply chain blew up. And I think that is, and I said this is a story writ large. I mean, American manufacturing went to China in many ways, and that's left us undercapacitized, exposed in some ways. If solar power is the cheapest power in the world and we don't make it, well, all of a sudden we're dependent on China for, the new oil, let's say. If batteries are the new way, I mean, I grew up in Ohio, right? So if batteries are the new way to store energy and more or less, and motors make a car go, and we don't have that. We don't have Detroit. We don't have much of where I grew up and the auto plants and so forth. And so this huge shift to China that Stanley participated in is coming back our way, and hopefully a good way. That's one lesson. And the other thing we talked about in the book was there's innovation. I don't know if you want to go there or not.
Yeah, no, because it seems like they did make a big push into technology. And I would be curious to hear your thoughts on sort of one, why they did, but then also given the performance of the company over the last 5 years, if that push into technology, I guess, is related to some of the issues that they've had more recently.
Yeah, so Stanley, I think, correctly saw this opportunity with the electrification of tools. And I don't know if you've ever used a leaf blower or heard one in your neighborhood. I mean, they're loud, they're noisy, they're not actually all that safe for your ears. And so there's lots of innovation coming to it. And there's lots of different things you can do, like autonomy and lawn mowing, or just like a tracker. You lose your iPhone, you know where it is. You can put those in tools and figure out where they are, and all sorts of opportunity for them to add value. One of the recurring themes in the book that you just touched on is, what is culture? What are you actually doing? And so they were trying to create or emphasize a culture that had been innovative and certainly customer focused, but maybe not high tech. And they were trying to infuse this, hey, let's really look for some disruptive innovation. The issue that I think happened is, one, COVID kind of screwed up a lot of that. And all of a sudden you're fighting fires instead of executing on your plan. But for two, we have seen innumerable companies, just so many of them, try to impose a culture or a system or an idea or a strategy. And unless it's really ingrained in the daily action, it doesn't exist. One of the companies we follow today is Ingersoll Rand, which is a phenomenal manufacturer and has just a really well-tuned business system. And they call it almost insultingly simple, but they'll do these weekly meetings effectively where you have just a minute or so to say, here's what I'm working on. Here's where I have problems, here where I need help on, and let's move forward. And that way you can tell if everybody's on task or not, and whether there's problems coming up, and you raise issues quickly. If you can raise an issue very quickly, then you can solve it quickly. And I think Stanley had this sort of tops down, let's do innovation, and it never got ingrained in the daily culture. And so if you don't have almost a weekly cadence, a daily cadence, maybe a monthly cadence around what are you trying to accomplish? Are you accomplishing it? If not, how do we fix it? That's perfectly fine. You're always going to have problems, but you got to find them and fix them. That's the essence of continuous improvement. And if you don't, then you're going to be very far off track before you realize it, kind of the cat story. And so I think Stanley got very far off track on the innovation effort. It just didn't click. It led them to spend money that was not usefully, didn't earn a return. And then they had fires to fight in the meantime. So it all kind of fell down.
Got it. So it wasn't that the strategy of trying to be more tech forward was not the right strategy. It was that the sort of execution of that strategy came up short.
Yeah, I think the old, do you bet on strategy to bet on execution? I mean, execution is always going to do it, right? And so if you can have focus that's ingrained in daily action, you're going to win. So yeah, I still think there's lots of different innovations that can come to the outdoor tool world, the hand tool world or whatever that are interesting and useful. And unfortunately, execution fell down.
Well, let's talk about a company that has performed quite well over the last 5 years, United Rentals. People might recognize this company as they're driving down the highway. What does United Rentals do?
Yeah, sure. So United Rentals rents things, not like the wedding glasses or tables or chairs or anything like that, but they rent construction equipment. They rent everything. I mean, they'll rent 4,000 or 5,000 different things. But you can picture it as, the Morgan Stanley building where I used to work, there was a very tall lobby and you'd change the light bulbs. You need something to lift you up like 30 feet or whatever it was. And they'll rent you a scissor lift that will lift you up. You can rent excavators. You can rent trenching solutions. Trenching is actually an incredibly dangerous thing. If you dig something more than a couple, 3 feet deep, you should not get into it without making sure it's safe and the sides are shored up. And unfortunately, people die every year doing that. And so they'll make steel things with braces you stick in the trench and keep it safe. And then they'll rent you a pump that'll pump the water out so you can work in it. A lot of different things that hopefully reduce, now environmental and emissions, reduce capital costs for their customers and make jobs easier and safer.
The sort of genius of this business is that a lot of their customers, when demand for these types of product arises, it's very intense demand, but it's sort of short-lived. So if you're the services company that's changing that light bulb in the Morgan Stanley building, maybe you only need that. You might only use it for like a couple days a year. So you don't want to buy it and keep it on. You don't want to have to store it and keep it on your balance sheet. So you're more likely to try to go rent it, right?
100%. And again, hopefully it saves the whole economy or the whole system money because like that example, or like, a construction contractor that has a specific tool that they don't use every time. Do they need to buy it, store it, figure out what the maintenance schedule is, have somebody who's watching it, knows it's critical that it goes out in the next job. So we've changed the oil. All that stuff can be done better and more efficiently in some cases by an outside party that specializes.
Right. So although it's a good idea, what are some of the inherent challenges of operating a business like this?
Well, so that's both the investment opportunity and the thing that's made it a compelling investment because people haven't fully seen it, I think. So the easy way to knock the industry is to say it's a capital intensive. So, if you're a rental company, you own a lot of stuff. So you have to buy a lot of stuff. It's a capital intensive industry with relatively, and I don't think this is true, but this has been a perception, limited differentiation. So I can rent something from United Rentals or I can rent somebody from Joe's Rentals and it's the same excavator in some ways, right? That was the knock on the industry 10 years ago. A little bit like airlines had the same knock 20 years ago. Anybody can start an airline. And then once you have the planes, they're expensive. You want to put people in the seats, so prices tend to revert downwards. The beauty of it is it's actually really, really hard to do. So picture the stress you'd have if your job is to design a truck that's efficiently loaded with 5 different things to drive through Brooklyn and then Manhattan and drop them all off by 9 a.m. or otherwise the job doesn't start and a million people are screaming at you and then get back at the end of the day with 3 things that need to be fixed. There's a lot of complexity in the business and drop off and pick up and repair and maintenance of 5,000 different things. And if you can do that efficiently, which is again, kind of what we're talking about, the culture of the system, the ability to sort of do something systematically and well and repeatedly, then you can add just a ton of value.
Right. It's a very logistically difficult business to run well.
It's an easy business to run badly. Yeah. It's a difficult business to run well. Exactly.
Totally. Let's go back to 2007. Mike Nealon became the interim CEO. Company's struggling. They are almost taken private, but then the buyer backs out at the last second. And then to make matters worse, the recession starts and demand from the construction industry dries up. What does Mike Nealon do?
So he did, and again, some of these things sound so obvious in hindsight, and some of them are hard choices, but he did a few things that were really bold. So for one, he invested in technology and in efficiency. And, when you're really struggling, keep in mind, '07 rolling into '08, the housing bubble popped. There was an infinite, quote unquote, construction demand that all of a sudden went down sharply. And they invested in systems and tech because they knew that delivering on this complexity was the value add, right? And the way to really keep in charge. He also did some very basic things with incentives. And the late Charlie Munger had said this. It's a great quote. He sort of said, I've been in the top, if I get it right, the top 5% of my cohort in understanding the power of incentives all my career, and I've always underestimated it. And so you think about that. People do what they're paid to do, and sometimes they try to do what they're paid to do. They think it's the right thing and they do it. And so United Rentals had been an assemblage of acquired assets and maybe hadn't been fully integrated and had some vestigial compensation systems. So one branch was competing against the next branch. You're in Stamford and somebody else is in Greenwich and you're competing against each other. Madness, right? And they were competing and compensated on EBITDA growth. Well, if you're a capital intensive industry, it's easy to grow your EBITDA if you add 50 machines. And even if you run them out one day, then you've added to your EBITDA if you're not charged for the capital. So he made some very smart and very basic decisions and some also bold decisions to really invest in the face of a downturn.
How did he change their compensation to sort of make the different branches work more collaboratively?
Right. And so, again, it's a very complex business, but it's one where scale can matter a lot and can add a lot of value. So in a simplistic sense, scale might mean, well, you can leverage your buying power to buy cheaper from Deere or whomever, right? But it's also there on a branch by branch basis. So if you have, 15, 20 branches in Atlanta, which has an inner and an outer and a ring around and so forth, how do you deliver most effectively to that? And so they changed the compensation system for one, and this is actually very similar to what Jim Umpleby did at CAT. You change the compensation system to be return on investment focused, to be like, hey, we have to make this a good decision, not just on margin, but how much money does it cost us to get there, right? So they changed the compensation system in that way, not to be EBITDA growth focused, to be more ROIC focused. But they also created cross incentives, around regions and around divisions, which again, that might seem obvious, but then you're changing culture and you're changing how people have been paid. So there's some real institutional momentum that you need to build around that. The payoff has been obviously massive. So not only do you stop competing against yourself, which, is fairly straightforward, but also if you can, again, deliver that the most efficiently, you can say, hey, yeah, we can actually get this through Atlanta traffic because we're not going to deliver it from the branch you'd normally deal with. We're going to deliver it from another one that's on the other side of the traffic jam or whatever. It can be real powerful. And so that's some of the things they did.
One other thing they did is they went on a bit of a buying spree, right?
They did. So, there's a couple lessons here. One is Brad Jacobs sort of was the initiator of this whole roll-up within United Rentals, and he has been a serial creator of billions of dollars of value. I mean, it's absolutely amazing, what they had done. So before Mike Nealon and before the current Matt Flanner era at United Rentals, Brad Jacobs has sort of started this roll-up, and it did accomplish a lot. It gave them nationwide footprint, and they were the biggest in the industry. So he sort of set the stage for all of this, right? And I would say one of the key things industrials have done well and delivered on and created value is once you've got a system humming, then you can add an asset in and bring it up to your level, and all of a sudden it's great. And we have a lot of great compounders of value in industrials. There's Danaher, which is now in many ways a healthcare company, but one of the most amazing companies in the world that people don't know of and is profiled in depth. I think Scott Davis, my co-author, did it better than anybody has ever done. The Danaher business system on doing things systematically right. There's a lot of key facets and you can go into it. Once you know how to do something, you can add assets easily. So rental is a fragmented industry where there's lots of rental companies in the country. And if you know how to, hey, we can buy this, we can integrate it into our logistics system, we can integrate it in our repair system, we can really do things better, we will. And so they went on an acquisition tear. Both before and after, but once they had all the systems, the compensation, the IT really humming, that could deliver tremendous value, and it has over the last 10 years.
Got it. In this section about United Rentals, you also talk about a sort of asset-light model that has become popular in Silicon Valley through Uber and Airbnb. And you point out that despite those companies sort of being asset-light on the outside, in reality, they're actually quite asset-intensive.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing to me. And to be fair, since then, Uber has really turned things around and has done in many ways very well or very profitable. The cash flow has improved tremendously. But to me, it's just fascinating because with United Rentals, sure, it's asset intensive. You have to buy this stuff. It's actually a very strong competitive moat as well because all equipment breaks. I mean, cars, we're used to them running. You buy a Toyota, it runs 100,000 miles and you never look at it, right? It's a beautiful thing. But when you're banging around in the dirt or you're in rough and ugly environments, freezing and cold, all this stuff, it's going to get broken. It's going to have wear. It's going to have issues. And so being able to service that asset effectively is important. And so one of the things we thought was interesting about Uber is that they would push the cost, they still do, I think, push the cost of capital to buying a car down to the people with some of the highest cost of capital in America. And you've ridden in cars, you talk to the driver sometime, they're borrowing at 20% to buy a car when Uber could have borrowed at 5%. And I don't mean to fully take issue with the strategy because I fully understand how much investors appreciate having capital-light growth. I get it. And if you can find enough drivers, enough people where it works, they can outsource the capital, and that can be smart. But the thing that we liked about United Rentals is they were able to manage that capital intensity while cash flowing a lot, enough to buy back 10, 20, 30, 40% of the shares over 10 years. And partly because owning the asset and or controlling the asset allowed them to manage the whole thing much more efficiently.
You point this out, they've built up a lot of expertise such that a very deep-pocketed competitor, like I couldn't, if I was able to just go raise a ton of money and buy up a bunch of equipment and start renting it out, I would still be at a pretty competitive disadvantage to United Rentals because they've built up all this little expertise about how to run this business effectively.
Yeah, I think it's incredible. And in investing, one of the things you're looking for is a moat. And sometimes the moat is just dead obvious. The iPhone's an amazing phone. It's just great, and then you have all the ecosystem of apps and everything else around it. And sometimes it's less obvious. In the case of United Rentals, I don't think it's immediately apparent to some just how difficult the logistics are and the repair and maintenance are, and stocking the right parts and having the right filter so you can put a machine back on and rent the next day. The complexity is really large, and it adds tremendously, I think, to the competitive moat.
Okay, so I want to take a step back from the three companies you wrote about it and just ask a couple general questions. The first is just about lean manufacturing. Mm-hmm. So you all mention it quite a lot throughout the book. And one of the things I was wondering is if it's given the success associated with it, why is it not always implemented?
That's a great question. Why isn't lean everywhere? I'm going to make that question even broader, and it's a really good one, is why isn't good and simple management systems, why aren't they implemented everywhere? And so one of the reasons is it's not always complicated, but it can be really hard to do. And so with lean, you need a management team that will commit to it, and you need every worker on the line to commit to it. Again, it's entirely dependent upon having a well-motivated, engaged workforce who will point out a problem and say, that's a quality issue. Let's stop the line. Let's call in engineers, who are senior and bring them all over. That's too much inventory over there. This tool is not working for this job, right? Let's put a suggestion in and fix it. So it requires a lot to sort of all come together. And it probably requires a lot to come together for 5, 6, 7, 8 years before you really see the full benefits. Just like Toyota has been, the most amazing car maker for decades. And why didn't, the big three copy it? Well, they did eventually, but Toyota continuously improves. And so they're setting the bar higher every single time. But it can take a little while to get momentum. But more generally, I think one of the core themes about the book, and if we ever read a sequel, is feedback loops are important. So lean is about continuous improvement. Continuous improvement is about finding a problem and fixing it. And we can all do this in our own lives, right? And any company can do it, not on a manufacturing line. And again, that's the relevance to the broader tech universe or the broader universe. If you have a well kind of inculcated system that says, let's find problems, let's bring them up, let's not blame people for them, because it's important that people wave their hand and say, hey, I've screwed this up. Can you come help me? Or somebody else has screwed this up and come help us. Then you can really identify problems and get better. If you don't do that, you just can't, right? You're just kind of drifting along, not getting better every year. And I think it's amazing how many companies that we do see kind of drift through the years without trying to get better every quarter. So it's something that's simple in concept, but it's very hard to implement because it takes some real cultural challenge, that you have to get through.
Makes total sense. It sounds like it's one of the things that prevents it from being implemented is just that there are short-term incentives not to, or at least not to stick with it.
So absolutely there's short-term incentives. Sometimes, you'll miss a production deadline. You're trying to solve a problem that will set you back. There's also, psychological things. Nobody likes feedback, right? I mean, it's hard. So you have to create an environment where you're getting feedback and giving it in a positive way. Nobody likes to say, hey, I have just utterly screwed this up. Can you please tell me how to fix it? That's embarrassing. That might get you fired. And the same is true of a line worker versus a CEO. We've had the chance to have a couple of really fascinating conversations, many in our career, But I got the chance to talk to a couple of folks who had been senior in managing programs at SpaceX. And they were at a different company, and I was just fascinated. I was like, oh my gosh, let's just talk, because I want to hear what the secret sauce is. I just can't wait to talk to you. And so I asked them a couple of things about the secret sauce. The answers were really fascinating, but one thing that was very consistent is very rapid feedback loops. I mean, when Tesla first came out, and I think the CEO of Audi, I think, wrote a note saying the way that Tesla has made everything Tesla designed allows them to do over-the-air operating software updates and so forth, because it's all one system and it's amazingly powerful. I mean, Tesla did that, I suppose, in part because of that, but also because the iteration loops are so fast. When you're designing it yourself, you can say, hey, let's do this. Let's make a part tomorrow. Let's see if it works. If it doesn't work, let's figure that out and make another one the next day, as opposed to sending it out for RFP and you say, hey, can somebody make us 10 of these and we'll test them. And 6 months later, you get them back, if you see what I mean. And so continuous improvement feedback loops, culturally allowing failure and allowing you to say, this is a failure, let's fix it and move on. Those are beautiful things, but they're not always easy to do. And so the incentives you see both at the personal level and at the, oh, my team screwed this whole project up. That's an incentive, to bury in some ways, right? Versus get better. What I think about when I reread the book and I think about in the lessons we've learned, the concept of a feedback loop, the concept of humility, of being able to accept feedback, of being able to say, yeah, it's okay that we failed. Let's make it better. And let's get on making it better, not let it go, are some of the most important lessons.
Really interesting. Yeah, I hadn't heard it explained like that before. So yeah, that's super interesting. One of the themes you talk about is that you all think there's a bit of an overemphasis on the role that disruption plays in a company's success or failure. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I don't mean to minimize disruption, but I think what we're trying to say is that, in a competitive world, things will get copied, right? So you can have the most transformational innovation that you can think of, and presumably somebody is copying it the next day, right? And so innovation is a difficult thing to sustain as an enduring differentiating factor. And I'm not an Apple analyst, and we have somebody on the team who is, but you think about how transformational the iPhone was. And I don't know if you had a BlackBerry or a Palm Pilot or any of the devices that came before that versus the iPhone. It was like, wow, this is amazing. And their competitive advantage in some ways evolved to being efficiency and supply chain and excellence and all sorts of things added on to that innovation over time. So, yeah, I think that's a big point. We're not dismissing the potential or the power of breakthrough innovation, but what comes after that? And what comes after that has to be continuous improvement, feedback loops, making things better every day so the people who are copying you don't catch up.
Right. Okay, I want to ask about Danaher, partly because I'm from Washington, D.C. The Rails brothers, I think, were born and raised there, still live there, and Mitch Rails is now part of the Commanders ownership group, and I'm a huge Commanders fan. So I feel like I have to ask about Danaher. Do you think that could be replicated in today's world, or is part of the success that they had related to the time that they were operating in?
I think it can be replicated. And I think the Rails brothers have done it a couple other times with various, spin-offs and fragmentations of Danaher, for example. And so certainly there was a time when people didn't fully grasp the importance of some fairly basic things on ROIC. I mean, if you think about Roper, which is another chapter, Brian Jellison identified that people just valued software companies wrong, just didn't get the power of not having any capital investment, having negative working capital, having your customers pay you before you deliver the product, having no physical things to make. That was all wildly misvalued. And that might be hard to replicate because the world obviously has caught up over the years to that. But the core things that Danaher has done on the Danaher business system, which is very well advanced now, and you can't just jump right in, but common sense vigorously applied, feedback loops, continuous improvement. These are things that are not fully embraced at every manufacturer in the U.S. or every company in the U.S. And so I think there's a tremendous opportunity for companies to develop systems, go in, acquire somebody who might have a great product or great marketing team or a great something, but doesn't have the full package and add value to them. Yeah, I do.
What are some of the characteristics of the Rails brothers, particularly sort of their attitude and mindset that enabled them to build a business like this, sort of in a way that I think that the average person would sort of maybe fall temptation to some of the more short-term incentives around business building that the Rails brothers were able to stay disciplined about?
Look, I think, there's a quote somewhere that, one of the greatest failures of the human race is the inability to comprehend the exponential function.
Hmm.
Compounding results get more powerful over time. So if you can put in the effort, and again, lean takes time, but if you can put in the effort to get something working, and then all of a sudden you have a base and you can make something else work better, and you can apply that capital to somewhere else and make that work better, the sort of exponential curve around all those improvements is huge. And so patience is a big one. We've talked to, and you asked if you can replicate Danaher. I mean, there are other industrial compounders that do very, very well in various niches in the industrial world. Ametek is a beautiful company. IDEX is a beautiful company. Ingersoll Rand is a great company. And so there's people doing various iterations of this. I think one differentiator of Danaher and maybe of companies that have a significant founder owner stake is just boldness. The willingness to say, hey, we've run this path a long way. Let's move Danaher into something higher growth. Let's blow it up. I mean, that's a hard thing to do. And it's a hard thing to do when you're a CEO reporting to public shareholders and so forth. And so I think I think Buffett probably has said this over times. I mean, having a founder owner stake that's profound and well involved, I think has been really meaningful for some companies. And I think that's true at Danaher too. The board and the management team have been willing to make some transformational bets over the years that have generally paid off very, very well.
So I do want to ask a question about Boeing. I know you didn't write the section on Boeing, but I read your book about a year ago. And as all the news started to come out and the headlines about Boeing started to come out, I wasn't that surprised to see that they were having the types of issues that they're currently having. I don't want to delve into it too much, but I guess I might be asking sort of an overly simplistic yes or no question, but are you surprised to see the issues that they're having?
Well, I think you have to have humility. If we'd understood it perfectly, not my stock, but if we'd understood it perfectly, we would have done a better job covering it over the last 5 or 7 years. And probably Carter would agree. Look, I touched on this earlier, but one of the core values that great companies do is really safety. I mean, it can be very, very tempting to try and push something out that your customers need or want. And I'm speaking more to my companies and the production line and worker safety, employee safety. I don't think it's PR in any way when Cat's CEO gets up and says 15 years ago, we need to fix safety. I think for one, that's the culture of Cat. They cared a lot about the company. For two, knew that if safety is wrong, everything's wrong. And so, I think that is a core value of all the best companies that we follow.
So CEO compensation has become a sort of hot button issue, and I'm not going to ask your perspective about that. But I think in reading your book, it really sort of drove home to me how difficult that job can be because the CEO, there are so many different interests, investors, employees, management, customers, and suppliers. All those interests are slightly misaligned, and the CEO has to balance that and manage all those different stakeholder relationships. So, what do you think? What are some of the soft skills that a successful CEO should have in managing those stakeholder relationships?
Boy, it's a great question. I mean, it's a tough job, and you didn't ask, what we think about it, but I can say for sure that we've seen great companies with lots of great jobs either built or destroyed, sometimes from the C-level seats, right? So it's a job with a tremendous level of responsibility and a tremendous level of complexity. Soft skills are interesting. I mean, it is, if you're Caterpillar CEO, you want to make 110,000 people kind of point in the same direction, focus on safety, focus on quality, focus on, the right kind of production metrics, et cetera, and marketing and sales and design, a bunch of other things, technology change. There's a lot going on. Again, I think all of the success stories that we study, both before the book and after, where things are going well, is where the culture is very clear, where the mission is very clear. And I don't mean that from a very big picture, arm wavy, let's go to Mars, kind of a way. But when you come in, what is your job? I think we either wrote it in the book or in a note. You asked the CEO of Toyota, what's your job? Well, I'm trying to reduce waste. What does that mean? Well, that's what continuous improvement is. You're trying to figure out what is a wasteful process, a wasteful step, a wasteful, waste of time, a waste of material, waste of energy on a production line, and fix it. And so it's not easy to do. But I think when CEOs have enough time at organizations to sort of get things moving, then you get everybody rowing in the same direction at the same time. So those soft skills, I mean, I've seen our CEOs, Vicente Reynal at Ingersoll Rand, goes to China all the time. These guys work pretty hard. Sure, you have a private plane, but you're flying all over the world all the time to get on the factory line and thank workers for working through COVID in a very difficult situation, to connect with people. Anyway, so I think that the soft skills involve a little bit of politicking, a lot of balancing of different interests. It's true. And a lot of just mental load trying to figure out, how to make all that fit together every day.
So, based on what you have seen in your career and the topics you all wrote about in this book, what advice would you give to the executives at the big tech companies? What advice would you give them in terms of maximizing their chances of success and survival over the coming decades?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that leans towards arrogance because obviously there's a lot of a lot of things that we don't know about, and what we're trying to do is bring our expertise in the things that we do know about that we think is applicable. And I guess, put most simply, that when innovation fades, how to run an organization efficiently and effectively with the proper feedback loops is a big one. And so I think the biggest lesson I learned in thinking about this and talking for hours with Carter and Scott, humility is a big thing. Things can change. You can always get something wrong. And I think it's a core trait in a culture that is looking for what's changing. And obviously the tech guys have to deal with change that's 10 times faster than anything else in our world. And so if you're able to build an organization around humility and the ability to accept feedback, the ability to accept change, I think that's a big one. And I think, developing those feedback loops around the right processes is huge.
Thank you so much for doing this. I have a million other questions I would want to ask, but I want to be respectful of your time. Yeah, really enjoyed your book. I recommend everyone should go read it. And yeah, thank you again.
Thank you very much.